This is the Protestant Libertarian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I really hope that you guys enjoy today's show. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. My guest today is Dr. David Beito. Dr. Beito is an American historian, a research fellow at the Independent Institute, and professor emeritus at the University of Alabama. He has written several books and articles, including his most recent entitled The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, in which he outlines the way in which the Roosevelt administration trampled on the rights of American citizens. We will be discussing this book on the show today. Dr. Beito, welcome to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast.
Thank you for inviting me.
Hey, I am really excited to talk to you about this. I do got to apologize to my audience real quick. There's a lot of allergies and stuff happening here, and I've had to use my voice a lot at work this week. So my voice is on its last leg, but we're going to make it through this today. So if I sound a little bit more rougher than normal, that's it. Before we get into the book,
I could fill in the gaps.
Oh, I love that. Thank you very much. So before we get into the book, tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and your work.
All right. Well, I'm from Minnesota originally. I got my PhD at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. I've done several books. One was my dissertation was a book about tax revolts during the Great Depression. And then I did a book on mutual aid, how social welfare was provided by voluntary mutual aid organizations in American history. And I did a biography of a civil rights leader named T.R.M. Howard. And he was a key figure in the Emmett Till case. And I think you'll be hearing more about him because there are various ideas in the works, including a possible series on him. And then I've done this book, and it has been a book that I've been working on for maybe 15 years, maybe longer. And it involves a lot of primary documents research, and it is called The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights, and which deals with FDR's mass surveillance, his concentration camps, his censorship. It looks at the dark side of FDR, because that really is the only side, when it comes to the Bill of Rights, at least. And it involves a lot of primary documents research. If you're familiar with the literature on FDR, pro or con, I think you'll find some new material here that you maybe haven't seen before. I think you could bear me out on that.
Well, this book was extremely relevant. And as I was reading through it, you know, when you watch the news or listen to political commentators talk, they always make it sound as like it's as bad now, than it's worse now than at any time before in history. But this book is incredibly relevant and shows that like a lot of the problems that we're facing in our society today have roots that go back beyond, 5 or 6 years ago. So what motivated you to write The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights?
Yeah. Well, I've always been interested in this period, the 1930s. A lot of my research has touched upon it. I've always found it to be a fascinating transition period in American history. And I've read a lot of the literature about the Great Depression and FDR. I'm not an economic historian, but I dabble in it a bit. And, here's a man who frankly had a record that wasn't very good on economics, but has a very good reputation as a successful president. And so the more I read about him, the less I sort of appreciative of him I became. And what came through very often with FDR was a kind of anything that it takes mentality. Very much whatever it takes, we're going to do it. If it bends the law, if it breaks the law, a deviousness, a kind of backroom aspect to FDR behind the scenes. He's doing a lot of things. And so I just sort of started to see that this had an impact in his view towards individual rights. But yet again, he is often quoted as the guy who gave us the 4 freedoms and has a good record when it comes to that issue, with some big exceptions like Japanese internment. Even there, though, that people all look for mitigating factors. So I thought a general study of what his attitude was towards the Bill of Rights. And this is not only in wartime, but in peacetime. It was in order. And it had been done before, at least in this way, So there was a lot of opportunity there. And what I found was, Japanese internment. I thought originally maybe I didn't even have to write about that because everybody knows about it. I could write about other things. But David Thoreau, the Independent Institute, said you have to write about that. So I did. And I'm so glad he said that because I saw some new things on that. And I also saw how it interconnected with the FDR who's doing sedition trials, engaging in mass surveillance, and trapping gay people. I'm seeing that this all kind of fits together in some of the same people. So it's a big puzzle piece, I think you could say, Japanese internment. Very big, if you want to look at his record on the Bill of Rights. Gigantic, but it's one of many puzzle pieces.
Well, and you also at the beginning of your book situate him within the historical context of the progressive era more generally. So how does he fit into that progressive era in American history?
Yeah, there are different strains to progressivism. There are more pro-civil liberties strains. He doesn't come out of that tradition. Although later he sort of uses that rhetoric. The two most important influences on FDR, and he is a man of ideas. He's not a deep thinker, but he definitely has an ideology. Are his cousin, he often called him Uncle Ted, even though he was a distant cousin. Although I guess he was sort of an uncle when he married Eleanor, because Eleanor Roosevelt was TR's niece. So technically, I guess that made him kind of an uncle. And he sort of patterns his career after Teddy. They have remarkable parallels in their career trajectory, in where they went to school, and the kinds of people they knew, and the class they came from, so forth. And then Woodrow Wilson. So this is an interesting thing. Wilson and Roosevelt don't get along, but Teddy and Wilson don't get along, but Franklin is an early supporter of Wilson, very early. He's there on the ground floor. He becomes Assistant Secretary of the Navy under Wilson and sees Wilson as kind of a mentor. So he borrows a lot of Wilson's ideas as well. He fuses these two different kinds of progressive traditions together. And those are the people that are influential. Now, when he's coming on the scene is a time when progressivism as an ideology in the 1880s, 1890s is making inroads in American education. So, of course, FDR is influenced by that. What does he take from that? A big thing he takes from that is a view that the ends are important. His view, democracy, justice, equality, right? He believes these things, right? In his conception. But the important thing for him is to achieve the goal. And you're not going to worry so much about procedures or constitutional niceties or that kind of thing, because you want to get the goal. That is a strain of progressivism that comes out of a book written by a guy named Herbert Crowley. And Crowley is a guy that was originally a Roosevelt fan, becomes a Wilson fan. Interesting parallel there. But that was one of the things he said. He said the beauty of what TR is doing is he is using Hamiltonian means, meaning big government, to achieve Jeffersonian ends. Now you could debate that, but he said the Jeffersonian ends would be equality, democracy. He's using big government that used to be used for the aristocrats, and he's not worrying about constitutional procedure too much to achieve the good end. That is FDR's outlook. And now he may not consciously, he probably did know Crowley, he probably read him, but he imbibes that tradition.
Now, in our high school history classes, we were always told that essentially the New Deal was a program that was designed to get America out of the Great Depression. And that was more or less the end of the story. But you talk about in your book how a lot of the ways in which FDR and his administration violated people's civil rights had to do with opponents of the New Deal. And so I think it might be helpful for a lot of people, before we get into some of the specifics of the Roosevelt administration, maybe just explain the historical significance of the New Deal, because I think that we're taught we're given a lesson about the New Deal that is taught through a rose-tinted lens. We're taught to think that it was good and we needed it to get out of the Depression. What's the real story behind the New Deal, and what is the significance historically of the New Deal?
Well, I guess I just say briefly, again, this is not a book, although I think economic historians and several of the people that have given it positive reviews are from that background. It is not a view that looks at the economic history so much of the period. Now, I will say in general, if you look at the literature, whatever side you're on, we're still in double-digit unemployment, eve of Pearl Harbor. So it is the longest depression in American history, depression/recession. There are several setbacks. So to argue that FDR got us out of the depression is problematic. Now, let's look at the relationship between civil liberties and that issue. Well, FDR is elected in 1932. He does not run on an agenda of a big government. He's kind of contradictory, but he actually attacks Hoover as a spendthrift, as well as sort of indicates, well, maybe I'll, do something new. I don't know. But he doesn't lay out his New Deal agenda. In fact, if you look at some of his speeches, he sounds like Reagan. And I've shared some of these audios online. It's like unbelievable because he's talking about 25% cut in government spending and so forth. So anyway, he's elected, and we are at the bottom of the Great Depression. So there's a tendency for Congress, for everybody, for the press to rally around the president, give him whatever he wants. And he gets what he wants. But then, within limits, he might have wanted to do more, but he gets a lot. But in about a year, 2 years, there's rising opposition. There are people that are discontented with this. And you got to view FDR in real time. A lot of people don't do that. Bert Folsom taught me to do that. And if you look at polls, good polls, if you look at elections, like the election for by-elections, what you call them, special elections, or elections for the New York State Legislature where the Republicans captured it. Actually, FDR's is some trouble. And there are good polls in early 36 that show him losing. These are legitimate polls. These aren't like the polls that, were wildly off. So he's in trouble. And his view is we have to do something about these opponents of our New Deal programs. We have to discredit them. We have to undermine them. So it's political, whatever you want to call it. What's the term? Damage control, or et cetera. So the idea they come up with is let's have a congressional investigation, a Senate investigation. And let's find a good senator to run this. And it'll be an investigation of lobbies. Nobody likes lobbies, right? And we'll just give him maximum power. And it's clear from the guy we'll pick that he's going to go after anti-New Deal organizations. The man they pick is Senator Hugo Black of the state I now live in, of Alabama. Black is an attack dog. He's a loyalist. He's a demagogue. He's kind of like Huey Long. Really, if you listen to his speeches, he's a table pounder. Very few of those speeches survive, but the ones that do is like, this guy's out of control, man. Those rich people doing all kinds of stuff to us, stuff like that. And, just demagoguing, I would say. But anyway, okay, so Black, they asked Black to do it. And of course, Black's quite willing to do it. And he becomes chair of this committee to investigate lobbies. How does Black define lobbies? Well, what we're doing is a lobby, right? If you're talking about things and that could have an influence on the public ideas, then that's a lobby. And you can investigate it. So in other words, he can investigate anything he wants, pretty much. And so Black calls in these witnesses and from New Deal groups, and they're pushed back and they're kind of, he's not able to get them. So he's very frustrated. And somebody comes up with the idea, it's like, what if we got a hold of their private telegrams? Now, more than 50% of communication, long distance communication at this time was the private telegram. The private telegram is the text and email of its day. There's very close parallels. You say things in telegrams that you wouldn't say in letters. They're instantaneous. Virtually, a lot of these big companies, law firms have their own telegraphers. You send them out. Well, guess what? Under the law, Western Union, the big companies that do telegrams, are supposed to keep copies of all telegrams. And these have been, subpoenaed in the past, but it was always very specific. But Black has the idea, what if I get a hold of all these telegrams? And so what he does is he goes to Western Union and says, I want all telegrams sent in and out of Washington, D.C., to and from every single member of Congress. That's just for starters, right? Well, Western Union says, no, our customers are not going to appreciate this. And Black presses it and finally gets, with the administration's aid, FCC order to provide copies. So he and his staffers go in to Western Union, which is most of the telegrams. They go to the other companies too, but that's the biggie. And they say, we want all telegrams, copies of all telegrams sent by every member of Congress over the last 9 months. We want them all. That's our subpoena. It's not a subpoena. It's just a order. It's not, court doesn't even do it. And so, okay, Western Union doesn't like it, but they agree to it. And so they go in there and they start getting these big books, telegrams of Congressman Joe Smith. They go through them all. And they go through them all. And Black's orders are, well, if you see anything private, look past that. Just look for lobbying. That's, of course, what we're doing, right?
Right.
And so they do. And they go thousands a day. How many do they go through? At least 3 million. That's mass surveillance, folks. That's bigger than anything J. Edgar Hoover is doing at the time. I don't look so much at Hoover. I do look at him, but he's not the big mass surveillance guy at the time. So that's what they do. And they get copies, and then they're able to ambush the witnesses. Now, initially, this puts Black on the offensive. But then Western Union doesn't like this, and they start, as these subpoenas expand to include other people beyond this, like they'll say, we want all these people, they would communicate with this anti-New Deal guy in Chicago, whatever, right? There's a guy named, they start releasing this information. We're looking at your telegrams. This has been private before, right? And one of the guys they inform is named Newton Baker, who was Secretary of War under Wilson, and moderate, kind of mild-mannered New Dealer, kind of. And Baker is so upset when he finds out his private telegrams have been searched that he says, if I saw somebody lynching Hugo Black, I would not join the lynching, but if they were stringing the rope around his neck, I would not try to stop them. And this is a mild-mannered guy, so outraged by this. Another guy that finds out is named Silas Strawn. Big law firm in Chicago still bears his name. Strawn was, this is a big guy, head of the National Chamber of Commerce, head of the American Golf Association, head of the American Bar Association. He's got everything. He's a big guy, and he finds out this is going on. He sues, violation of Fourth Amendment rights and so forth, privacy. Privacy is a word, by the way, they use all the time. And he wins. Basically, he wins. The court says, a district court says, you can't do that anymore, Senator Black, but we have no power to do anything about what you've done already. So Black has to back off eventually and says, all right, well, I've done enough anyway. I've got my millions of telegrams, right? But it's a good precedent for the future. So this is headline news. Black Committee, I'd never heard of it until I started. And it's like headline news in the Washington Post, New York Times, you name it. They have editorials. It is condemned by the mainstream media, believe it or not. Overwhelmingly,
hard to believe.
It's condemned by a lot of Democrats, New Deal Democrats, big names, people that are regarded as kind of, loyalists. There's a lot of pushback, and it's a sad commentary on the present, in that there was a lot of pushback against all of these things I discuss from New Dealers and from socialists. But that isn't happening now, and I fault the right as much as the left, because I rarely see them speak up for the rights of leftists. So, but that was a different pattern then. Now it's just like, well, if our ox is being gored, then we're suddenly born again civil libertarians, right?
Yeah.
Like those college presidents. Oh, we're for academic freedom. Same people that, in the whole Hamas thing. Then, They suddenly discover something, but they're in a weak position because they never took a stand for anybody else. Had they taken a stand for some conservatives or libertarians, they might have had more support.
Yeah.
But you weaken your own support base by being selective when you're in trouble.
Yeah.
And these people recognize that danger, I think. And they were good, they were just good people. I mean, not good people, but they had friendships that span the ideological spectrum, like H.L. Mencken, libertarian. Mencken was friendly with everybody, but he had very pronounced views on the issues.
Yeah. And you talk about how Black does receive all of this opposition in the media, and they quietly kind of have to roll away the Black committee. But another FDR ally in the Senate, Sherman Minton, is going to step in and create another committee. And there's one really interesting story that you tell in this book about how in 1938, and this is just so relevant to what we are experiencing politically today, where Sherman Minton tries to pass a bill that criminalizes what he calls false news. So walk us through the story of the Minton Committee and his attempt to try to criminalize false news. What did he mean by that? What was he trying to accomplish, and how would that have potentially benefited FDR?
Well, Minton is a FDR loyalist, kind of forgotten now. When you Google him, at least a while ago, the Sherman Minton Bridge was the big thing, came up with him. But Minton was a younger guy, younger than Black, rising up in the Senate leadership, very loyal to FDR. In fact, was FDR's first choice for the Supreme Court, but he wanted to stay in the Senate, so he chose Black. And Black got on the Supreme Court because he was a good loyal guy. So those are the things that counted FDR. Okay, Minton becomes chair of the same committee. It's dormant for a while. Then he becomes chair of Black's committee. And he can't do private telegrams anymore. He tries other things like subpoenaing membership lists, private information as a means of intimidation. That kind of backfires. People fight him. And so Minton is so frustrated at the suggestion of someone in the administration. I think FDR. And why do I think FDR? Because FDR was very worried about fake news. He used the term fake news. He said he would talk to reporters and say, I know you guys are told what to report. I know they tell you what to do. He hated the press. He sounds like a lot like Trump. But anyway, he proposes a bill to make it a felony to publish any article in a newspaper or magazine known to be false. Right? And Minton proposes this. I think it's a trial balloon that FDR is having him afloat. He's not the kind of guy that go off half-cocked. But what happens is a disaster for Minton politically, because people are going, you can't do that. And I'm talking about New Dealers. They just like all over the place. They start bashing this guy who's a loyal administration guy. New Dealers are bashing him, and he has to pull the bill out. So this is, again, an encouraging contrast, or discouraging, with the present. This bill is shot down across the spectrum. He becomes a laughingstock, and Minton is defeated, many say, 2 years later, because he did this bill. There's that bill to censor the press. People remember it. And he ends up on the Supreme Court, though, eventually. Harry Truman appoints him. So there you go.
Yeah.
He ends up on there with Black. He was Black's protege in many ways. So.
Yeah. And again, there are a lot of parallels between those two figures and many people that are in Congress today. And there is kind of like what's really interesting about the first couple of chapters of your book is that you chronicle the parallel attempts to try to censor both the printed press, the media and the printed press, and then also radio at the same time. And you have a couple of chapters that are devoted to the censorship of radio. This was almost entirely new information for me as I read through those chapters. But I want to start at the beginning of that story because I think it's very important and relevant for this conversation. And you are fully transparent in the fact that FDR and his administration and his allies are not the first people to begin trying to censor and limit the amount of content that can be produced on radio. And actually, it goes back to the Coolidge administration. And I know a lot of people that are kind of in mine and yours camps politically, Coolidge is silent cow. He's supposed to be the limited government kind of guy. But radio censorship really begins during his administration. So walk us through the beginnings of that story. When is this drive by the government to try to censor or limit the content that is on the radio? When does that begin?
Well, when I wrote this book, I thought, well, the book's about FDR after all. But then I said, look, I got to go back further. The whole infrastructure of radio, which Roosevelt manipulates and expands, is in place. So it only went back, 13 years earlier. And I did one chapter on what happened to radio. Because if you look at radio in the early 1920s, it is arguably freer than the print press. There's no prior restraint laws. There's no state censorship laws, partly because the federal government says, well, the people own the airways, or we own them, or whatever. We have jurisdiction, so you can't censor it. But then the federal government has no role, basically because they're constrained by the courts and other things. So it's a de facto property rights system, where people have property rights in the electromagnetic spectrum. If people violate those rights, they in effect homestead them, then, that's against the law. So it's a pretty rigorous property rights, de facto property rights regime, and it's free. And you have a wide diversity of opinions on the radio. You have socialist stations, you have labor union stations, you have a bunch of these religious cranks, you've got the budding networks. So it's a free place to a great extent. But there are a lot of people that don't like that. And one of them is Herbert Hoover. Who I never really saw as a hero, but Hoover is a big government guy. And that's his background. He always is. And Hoover's view is this is the people's airways and we should not have commercialism. And they shouldn't have political points of view. They should be generic, right? The idea of the generic idea, which of course has fallen apart now with NBC and so forth. But that's, people still look back to that tradition. Oh, you just, you report the news, you kind of appeal to everybody, whatever, right? That was what Hoover wanted. And so Hoover is able to manipulate things through very Machiavellian ways, in such a way to throw a monkey wrench into this system by basically the federal government stands down from enforcing property rights. But then, actually, it's a story where people start reestablishing the property rights through the common law. And this is starting to happen, but it isn't given enough time. There is enough chaos because of Hoover's stand down order, essentially, that there is enough of a window of opportunity to create the Federal Radio Commission, which in effect nationalizes the airwaves and deletes about 600 stations for no good reason, really, because the technology would allow them to be accommodated, and favors what we came to know as the big networks. So it becomes politically controlled. You have equal time rules. You have all sorts of things. And fast forward to not so fast, really, but you go to 1938, FDR is able to manipulate radio not only through his fantastic presence and voice, but he's able to manipulate it politically behind the scenes very often, putting pressure on advertisers behind the scenes, using the FCC, using implied threats. By 1938, there is not a single anti-FDR commentator on network radio. They still survive on some of the smaller stations, but network radio, which is like, I forget, 70%, 80% of where Americans are listening, you don't have any anti-New Deal people left. By contrast, the print press is always against FDR. He hates this. The print press mostly opposes him in every election. So you get an interesting contrast, and the print press becomes freer because prior restraint laws are struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. Radio becomes more politicized and controlled. So it has an interesting, in about a 10-year period, you reverse, less than 10 years really. One becomes politicized, one becomes pretty free, the print press. And Americans are kind of wedded to that. They really like to have a free print press. And the trouble with the radio is it's confusing because the standard argument is, well, radio can't be treated like the print press because we have limited supply, of the electromagnetic spectrum. Of course, by the end of this period, more people are getting their news. There are more radio stations than daily newspapers. And there's a lot of technology developing and so forth. So that's just a BS argument, but it's used to justify this political control. That and other things, but that's the main thing that's used. Well, it's not like a printing press. Anyone can use a printing press. Well, yeah, but radio they justify really draining it of political debate and opposition, and they are successful to a great extent by the end of this time.
Yeah, chapter 6 in your book was actually, I think, the most frustrating of all the chapters to read in this book, because you talk about how this all takes place in Memphis, Tennessee, and there's an FDR ally named Edward Crump, and he goes after a black conservative named J.B. Martin, and goes after quite a few black conservatives in just some blatantly racist ways. And the entire time, FDR turns his eye to the situation in Memphis, and it creates quite a bit of problems. So I want you to tell the story of Crump versus Martin in Memphis to my audience, because it is an absolutely insane story. And it was one that, as I was reading it, just the entire time I was thinking to myself, how could any modern day progressive think that FDR was a good person by standing by and allowing this to happen? But they got to hear the story before I guess we can talk about the morality of it. So explain the story of those two figures to me.
Okay. This is another thing I'd never heard of, right? And I was doing work on the book, and I did an article called New Deal Witch Hunt and got some attention. But this guy wrote me. He was not a libertarian or conservative or anything, but he was a Memphis journalist who's written a lot of interesting stuff. And he was writing about this period in Memphis. He said, well, if you're interested in New Deal Witch Hunt, you might be interested in this. And he sent me all this stuff, internal government documents from the Department of Justice. And of course, I got a lot more, but he introduced me to the topic, and I'm like, my God, this doesn't really fit in. Man, this does fit in. It fits in. Now, the story here is there is this he actually is mayor for a very brief time, but he's the political boss of Memphis for like 30 years. And his name is Edward H. Crump, Boss Crump. And he runs that city top to bottom. And he's the old-fashioned political boss, but he is an FDR guy. And this is a part of the story that I tell that hasn't been told as much as it should be. And that is FDR is close simpatico with the big city Democratic machines, which are often seen as on their way out during this period. They aren't, and he uses those machines. One of the big machines is in Memphis. And there's a guy there who's Crump. And Crump was an FDR supporter in 1931. He's what they call an original FDR man. He was there at the convention helping to get FDR the nomination. He was at all the conventions helping him in various venues. He's a big ally, and he helps gin up votes. And FDR likes Crump. He throws a lot of money his way, a lot of New Deal money, a lot of public housing projects that are, by the way, very discriminatory, that tend to be built in the black neighborhoods and level many black neighborhoods and are segregated. So anyway, but there's a weird thing about him, and it's an aberration for the South. Most of the South, blacks are disfranchised, but in Memphis, they're actually still voting in large numbers. And Crump allows that to continue opportunistically. He makes an alliance with the Black Republican Party, interestingly enough, which is part of the National Party. It's controlled by blacks in African Americans in Memphis. And he kind of makes an alliance, but as long as, they sort of don't step on him and they could be useful when he needs them to mobilize politically, he sort of uses them. But then they get a guy who's elected head of the party, the Republican Party in Memphis in 1940, named J.B. Martin. Well, I'd never heard of him. This guy, I love this guy, right? He is the head of the National Negro Baseball League. He is head of the Republican Party in Memphis. He's a very anti-New Deal Republican. He's a black guy. He owns one of the largest black-owned drugstores in the South, which is kind of a show place. And he says, look, I think we can carry Memphis and carry Tennessee for the Republicans. It happened in the 20s. Maybe it could happen again. He has an alliance with the white Republicans who are in the eastern part of the state, mountain Republicans. He has an alliance with them. And so he organizes his rallies in Memphis. He wants to carry the city for Wilkie, the Republican. And what happens is he has a rally of like over 1,000 people, white and black, multiracial. And Crump, he does not want to be embarrassed. Crump sends a message to Martin. You better shut down that next rally you're planning. You better shut down Republican headquarters. And you better resign as head of the Republican Party or I'll police you. I don't know if Martin knew what he meant, but he knew it wasn't good. But Martin says, oh, man, I'd like to, and he tries to kind of appease him, but he says, I got to go ahead with the rally. We're planning it. All right. So they go ahead with the rally. That evening, the drugstore is being policed in 2 shifts. I think it's open in the evening. So it's policed all day and into the night, every second. Everybody is searched who goes in and out, including school children, including priests. And he starts expanding it to include other black Republicans. And this is blatant. Local Memphis paper said, you can't do this. This is going too far. This is exactly what he's doing. And it's incredible. But he does this. And then Martin is upset about this and he complains, but he can't get any lawyer to represent him because they're all afraid. It's like a totalitarian society for blacks in Memphis. And he has no success. Then he finds out that Crump is got these trumped up charges that he's going to throw him potentially in the workhouse. This is a guy that's in his 40s or 50s. So they'll kill me. And so Martin just leaves. He has to leave. He keeps his businesses there, and he comes back one time in 1943. And what happens? He goes to a stadium that he had helped build called Martin Stadium, where the black teams played. The Black League played there. He goes and watches it from the presidential box. He is arrested by the Crump's police. He's thrown in a cell, and he's ejected from Memphis. And he complains. Other people complain. He has allies in the Republican Party who complain. And he's deposed by the Justice Department. And the guy that's head of the Civil Rights Division said, I think we have a great case here. It's so open, but it's shut down. There is no prosecution pursued, even though there are good people here over and over again, including in the federal government who has civil liberty sensibility. They're willing to go forward, but it's stopped. Well, Crump is Martin's very upset. So he and some other people go to a guy named A. Philip Randolph, many of us have heard of, the head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters, who is, big guy, well-known in black history, but a tiger for civil libertarianism, just great on civil liberties. And he goes down there in Memphis and he does a speaking tour challenging Crump. He challenges him to a debate. And he's like in his face. But then he's mistreated too, but he can take it because he doesn't have to stay there. And he writes to his good friend, Eleanor Roosevelt. And he said, please help me. Please help. We have fascism here in Memphis. Please do something. There's been an attempt to prosecute this guy. We need your help. And Eleanor does not write back. But then she finally writes back after a long delay and sends a letter that has like 2 sentences, 2 or 3. Said, I've been told that this is not a good time to pursue this. Very cryptic. So Eleanor doesn't help. Nobody helps. Well, that's not true. Lower level people in the Justice Department are willing to move forward. But it's stopped. And this just happens. And Crump establishes total control there. He essentially takes over the local Republican Party, puts his henchmen in it, and he expels, several people, and he establishes a kind of, someone called it a most perfect espionage system, where there's spying. He buys off blacks, including black Democrats, and pretty much destroys this opposition. And the Republican Party actually seems like it was willing to help Martin, but the case was put on hold because Martin had reason to believe that this lower level investigation, the sympathy he got from the lower levels of the Justice Department, would result in a case, and it didn't. And by the time he found out, it was kind of too late, and nothing happened. And he ends up in Chicago. It's a happy story for him. He becomes a fairly important political figure in Chicago. He's elected to office in Chicago. He's a loyal Republican for the rest of his life, and still remains head of the National Negro Baseball League.
The other obvious black mark on FDR's career in terms of racial tensions comes during World War II. And this is the one that everybody knows, the Japanese internment situation. You talk a lot in your book, and I kind of want to come back to this at the morality of it, at least for the way that it's been perceived by people on the left since then at the end of the podcast. But walk us through internment, because there are a lot of people that make excuses for FDR that he had to do it because of the war. But the reality is he locked up over 120,000 Japanese citizens, as you say in your book. 2/3 of them were, are Japanese Americans. 2/3 of them were American citizens during that time. Why did he send these Japanese people to the internment camps? And how was that even possible in a country where people are supposed to have freedoms that are guaranteed by the Bill of Rights?
Well, first of all, you sort of hinted this, but let's just say, how is this dealt with in history textbooks? Well, none of them are defending FDR anymore, right? Exactly. Not exactly. But they're the mitigating circumstances. So if you look at these mitigating circumstances, you might come away saying, well, gee, too bad he did that, but he really kind of had to. They say the same thing, by the way, in FDR's failure to support things like anti-lynching laws. Well, he had to kind of do that, because he needed to get other things. So that's sort of the argument that you get, that would be just too risky to take the sides of the Japanese Americans, and that would hurt the war effort or whatever. Some people will say, well, he was distracted, right? He put too much trust in the military, and they did it. And he kind of signed off, but he didn't really want to do it. I looked into this, and I said, that's sort of what I've been exposed to. And I looked at some really good scholarship that's been done, but that has not made it into the textbooks. It says, no, he's a hands-on guy. FDR has had racist views towards the Japanese Americans for a long time. A lot of other people have too, but they're kind of important to him. In the 1920s, he wrote op-eds where he said, we should not allow intermarriage. Okay. We should not allow Japanese to buy land in California. That's good that California is trying to prohibit that. We should certainly stop further Japanese immigration, because if they mix with Americans, that's just not going to be good. Intermarriage will not be a good result. That kind of stuff. Then in the 1930s, while president, he speculates, well, let's say there's an attack, Japan attacks the U.S. What do we do? Well, any Japanese, he suggests this, any Japanese American who meets a Japanese ship, fraternizes with Japanese crews, should be immediately put, his words, into a concentration camp in the event of war. So he's predisposed in this direction. And by the way, I got pushback, including from some people at the Independent Institute, but I was able to convince them. Rah, rah, rah. But they didn't like the term concentration camp. And my counter argument to that is, look, these were concentration camps. No, they were not death camps. No, they were not like, you had for the Jews. They were different, but they were concentration camps. And they were, that's what FDR called them, for God's sake.
Yeah.
Blaze 1944. And they're different than internment for, say, Italians and Germans, which I don't, I there's a lot of reasons to criticize that too. However, Japanese internment is, if you are in the area, which is the West Coast, you are put into concentration camps because you're of Japanese ancestry. So in other words, they'd put orphans there, for example. If you were an orphan, you'd go to camp. That's something different. You didn't put millions of Germans or Italian Americans. You didn't put Frank Sinatra or Dean Martin in internment camps, right? Because they were of Italian ancestry. it wasn't on that level. It was for the Japanese, if they lived where most Japanese lived, which is in the West Coast. Now, one exception. Japanese were not interned in Hawaii. Guess who wanted to intern them there? Roosevelt. When he did his executive order, he said, I made sure the wording would allow me to intern Japanese Americans in Hawaii. I have always felt that that should happen. He was saying that late after he signed his original order. Now, where do you want? What would that have involved? That would involve moving them to one of the smaller islands. What would that have involved? That would have involved taking ships off the front lines in the Pacific, midways going on, all that good stuff. That would involve taking those ships to transport these 40% of Hawaii's population, that's Japanese Americans, to a smaller island. The military and commander on the ground thought that was madness, but was very effective in dragging his feet, stopping it. FDR eventually, all of his top advisors basically say, this isn't realistic. They didn't put martial law in Hawaii, but they did not intern the Japanese. So in other words, FDR is predisposed in this direction. He is a mover, but he's very good about delegating and kind of making it seem like others maybe were taking the initiative, because he maybe recognized this, there were a lot of people that opposed it. His own attorney general opposed it. His own FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, and his own secretary of the interior. That's a pretty relevant guy. These are built in desert areas, right, under jurisdiction of that department. They all kind of went along with it, right, but they opposed it. So the idea that FDR just had to do it, and if you look at very early public opinion polls, I'm talking about before FDR made his decision, because there's a 2-month period here after Pearl Harbor before they do it. Public opinion polls show very little support for this. And newspapers, even in California, are saying things like, these are Americans, leave them be. They're American citizens. And what happens, though, is a rising hysteria, which FDR could have tamped down, and I don't think it's even that powerful. He could have tamped it down by one speech, one comment. He could have really made it a good PR thing for his agenda. We, unlike the Axis powers, believe in protecting the rights of every citizen. We're different than them. Therefore, we're protecting. Everybody would have been just fine with that. He never made such a speech. He was urged to make comments like that. He never did. Just sort of let it happen. He signed off on it. I think he's responsible for it. He creates the kind of conditions that make it happen needlessly. Because it would have been a great PR move for him. 4 freedoms. And he violates every single one of them for Japanese Americans. About a year after he made that 4 freedoms speech in 1941, that a lot of people love to quote, he was systematically putting Japanese Americans into concentration camps where their only economic freedom, freedom from want, is they get 3 meals a day in a cot, in a concentration camp. Whoopee, And these are people that have been very successful economically in California, remarkably successful, and agricultural production and so forth. Here they had to go to the camps, sell their property at fire sale prices, destroy their pets, right? Couldn't take pets along. Just cruelty. And FDR kept them there all the way through the 1944 election, even though by that time we were winning. His advisors were doubling down on urging him to let them go. He wanted to win that election. He didn't want any threat anywhere in California or elsewhere. So he kept him there. Just, I can't say anything more than that. Just strikes me as cold-blooded and cruel. And frankly, a lot of historians who've written this have kind of said the same thing. So I don't think I'm being unfair. He had advice, good advice. And then you let him go for no good reason. The election was over with. He also knew the Supreme Court was likely, one of the cases was sort of likely to limit it, and got ahead of the game. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it is truly a shameful story. The last couple of things I want to ask you about here before we talk about maybe his legacy to close out today is that during World War II, he actively tried to persecute and censor non-interventionists. And then there was a string of trials after the war called the sedition trials that are a reflection of, his goals. Obviously dies right before the end of World War II. These sedition trials were taken up under Truman after he passes. But talk to us about those two things. How did he persecute the anti-interventionists, and what did the sedition trials have to do with that?
Well, when I wrote this, I thought sedition, that's old hat, right? Sedition trials. I didn't imagine that I would be so incredibly relevant, that all of this would be so timely. And that is one thing where it's very timely. Okay, well, FDR hated the non-interventionists. We're a wide variety of people, socialists, pacifists, right-wingers. There were all kinds of people, New Dealers. There were non-interventionists. So, this is a good percentage of the American population. He hated them because they slowed him down. Well, the war happens, Pearl Harbor. What happens to all these people? They all support, almost all, endorse the war effort. Lindbergh, Senator Nye, you go down the list. They all said, we support the war effort. Let us know, Mr. President, what we can do to help. FDR is not, he remembers. And he wants to prosecute them still. He puts pressure on his attorney general. I want to get these people. I want to prosecute them for sedition. I don't believe them. I think that they hindered the war effort or whatever. He wants to censorship. And Francis Biddle, as attorney general, to his credit, is kind of a semi-hero here. Biddle says, no, we don't really have a case. He holds off the president. And Biddle writes about, and what's amazing to me, in his own autobiography, he goes at length, and very rarely is this quoted. Well, it's quoted, but not as much as you might expect. And Biddle just says the president just wouldn't give up on this stuff. Every cabinet meeting, he says, when are you going to indict the seditionists? And he'd be really mad about it, not joking around like he often did. And so Biddle finally gets sick of it. And basically what he does to appease the president, he says, okay, we're going to have a trial of seditionists. But these are, with some exceptions, these are more marginal types. There's some exceptions that are interesting. But these are guys that would run like a little newsletter in rural Nebraska, an old fogey. It was kind of maybe anti-Semitic, populist, ran this newsletter, right? Kind of harmless. And they were all over the country. And they scooped them up and did a mass sedition trial in Washington, D.C., and accused them of being part of a worldwide Nazi conspiracy under the Smith Act. And they said specifically they were trying to promote insubordination in the military, right? Kind of a stretch because there's no real evidence that they were even targeting the military. And there's no evidence that most of these people didn't even know each other. All these wacky people brought into one mass trial, each with their own lawyers. And it's like in a small courtroom and it's like chaos. And originally the public's like, yeah, that's bad. These are Nazis, man. You got to go after them. And we're offering them the right of, court trial and all that. Then finally, a lot of New Dealers, supporters of Roosevelt, start saying, wait a minute, there's nothing here. There's no conspiracy by these people. These people are harmless. This is a show trial. This is like the Moscow show trials. And there's rising opposition. And then it is falling apart. It's mismanaged by the government. And a lot of the New Deal appointed lawyers for the defendants are like switching sides. And so eventually the judge dies. He just drops dead, probably from all this chaos, which he helped bring about, really. And the government just talks about appointing another judge. They ultimately dismiss the charges. But within a year of that sedition trial, we get new sedition trial of communists. And so who had applauded the sedition trial of right-wingers? Now, under the same law. And this is interesting to me in that I hate sedition trials. I've always hated them. I wrote about this when I first heard that they were considering going after J6 people. I said this is open-ended, and I'm amazed
Yeah.
that there were some libertarians who didn't understand immediately. What is sedition? What's whatever you want it to be?
Yep.
And then you see the same thing that I think conservatives and libertarians need to write about. There is a trial for domestic terrorism of environmentalists now going on in Atlanta. Some of the same Fannie Willis people, she was like involved in bringing this, interestingly enough. And this is for domestic terrorism. These people that have been at these demonstrations, and there have been some violence like J6, but a lot of it was just like people coming to a demonstration and stuff. And they were being prosecuted under domestic terrorism, which is the same thing. It's open-ended. It's whatever you want it to be. So we need right and left to come together against this nonsense. And we see historically how this is happening. And we see it in J6, right? Prosecute these people then, if they're guilty. Vandalism, right? Violence, trespass. Get them on those things. Now, you can't lock them away for 40 years. I'm sorry, or 3 years, whatever. But you can make the point, right? No. We want this open-ended thing where we can put them away forever. And one of the people that was sent wasn't even there on J6. One of the people that was sent for like 3 years, and I forget his name now. And who wants to defend these people? This is what a lot of conservatives and libertarians were stuck with in the 40s too. People like John Flynn said these are all a lot of these people, not all of them, are in slavery. Who wants to defend them? I guess we have to, but we really don't want to do this. Same thing now. I don't want to defend a lot of these people. There are a lot of, but we have to. And we have to do the same for left wingers. So anyway, that's my little soapbox, but I see parallels. And unfortunately, one of the parallels is lacking. And I was stunned by this because I thought eventually there are going to be people like, well, I won't give names, like a guy that's well known for writing about civil liberties and things like that. I'll tell you who he is later. But, people like this, why aren't they speaking out on this? Why aren't they concerned about it? Well, and it just is stunning to me that there's so little interest, because I can't defend these people. Well, you can defend their rights. I don't get it. But that means that the libertarians have a role to play here in being defenders of civil liberties if nobody else is going to do it for all comers.
Yeah, I got two final questions for you before we get out of here. The first one has to do with FDR's legacy, especially with people that are on the left. Because right now, if you are on the left, racism is one of, I think, the top priorities for people that are oriented with the progressive movement today. But FDR was an obvious racist. Like Hugo Black was a Klansman, and he was appointed to the Supreme Court by FDR. And we saw everything that happened with J.B. Martin and Crump, and we saw what he did to the Japanese internment camps. And yet you say that there are many historians on the left that come up with excuses for all of these things or just ignore them entirely. If FDR had been a conservative, they would have torn down all of his statues. They would have renamed every building on a college campus that was named after him. But there's been absolutely no desire by people on the left to do that. So why is it that FDR has this horrible legacy, but he gets a pass from people on the left? And do you think that historically that will ever shift?
I think it will. And let me say one brief thing about the sedition thing, since it's related to race. FDR wanted to prosecute the black press during World War II for sedition because they were often critical of U.S. government policy, very critical. But they cut a deal with the black press, intimidating them basically to say, okay, you reduce your criticism, we won't prosecute you. So that's a story that adds to that. Okay, I think FDR is very vulnerable. It wasn't so long ago that Woodrow Wilson was consistently ranked in the top 10 presidents. That probably isn't as true as it used to be. It is now fashionable to criticize Woodrow Wilson. I remember, you probably remember too, when that was not so fashionable. People would overlook all of his stuff too. FDR's got more to overlook than Wilson. Well, yeah, I would say so. You have to forgive a lot.
Yeah, well, he had 4 terms.
Very bad civil rights record. You can keep saying, well, he had to get his New Deal through for forever, but that's a weak argument.
Yeah.
Because frankly, even a lot of conservatives like his own Vice President Garner wanted to do something about lynching. So he doesn't do anything, right? He doesn't appoint blacks to any key positions in his cabinet or his sub-cabinet. They have something called the Black Cabinet. Other Republicans had their own black cabinets before that. Big deal. These are black employees in the federal government who were referred to as a black cabinet. He doesn't have blacks in his cabinet. He has a terrible record, doesn't do anything about disfranchisement. Then you get Japanese Americans. I think that defenders of FDR, when I bring up these arguments, when others bring them up, they will rationalize for a while and then they'll just shut down. They don't want to address these arguments at length. They are on weak ground. And I think if you want a reassessment of FDR, you keep this up. You remind them. You bring up examples. You don't let them weasel out. I'm sounding like a politicized guy here in a way. I don't know if I am, because I think that this is wrong to history. It's not an accurate assessment of this man. It's not a full assessment of him. It's looking past the most horrific, I'd say worse than Andrew Jackson in a lot of ways. Anyway, comparable with it, the Trail of Tears. It's a horrific policy, and it's not isolated. And I think just hammer it, have the facts down, and bring it up and write about it. Because I don't think there's a good defense to make for the guy on these issues, frankly. I don't think it's convincing, and I think even the people that try to defend him do it in a kind of weak, half-hearted way. That's my experience anyway. It's like they create these kinds of, that's your argument, that's what you're hanging your hat on.
Yeah.
I don't think they're convincing, even to themselves. So he's vulnerable to have this legacy criticized and reassessed in a major way. And I think it's going to happen. I think it's beginning to happen.
The last question I want to ask you is what lessons we should learn from this time period. So there was, as I said, when I was reading this book, there were just so many things that happened during this period that were incredibly relevant for what we're dealing with today, whether it's the Patriot Act and the legacy of the Patriot Act, the wars overseas, whether it's like the net neutrality debates, and then, of course, coming out of 3 years of very vicious COVID censorship, where there were many actors in the government on both the left and the right that wanted to censor social media platforms. They wanted to censor news networks. I mean, it was bad, but it seems like there's so much of what's been happening over the last 20 years that really has roots going back to that time period. So what lessons should we learn from that period so that we can avoid the mistakes of the past?
You stated it very well. Censorship of media, of social media platforms. At that time, it would be radio, for example. You could say telegrams as well. But, using what you see in the Twitter files, often these things are secretive, hidden, where you're going to tamp down. You're going to meet with the powers that be and say, do you really want to have this person work for you? Why don't you tell them to stop this? All happening during this time. So you see parallels that are remarkably close, but this is not complete parallels. And the one lacking parallel is you don't have enough people who are willing on the left, who are willing to stand up for civil liberties. You had many, many more people. And frankly, I think you had a lot of people on the right that are willing to stand up for a lot of civil liberties. Japanese internment had a lot of support, but there were conservatives, a number of them who didn't like it, who opposed it, like the governor of Colorado, for example, like Hoyles, who was libertarian of the day, ran newspapers. There were a lot of people that were willing to cross political lines for reasons, in case of the Japanese, because they cared about people and they looked at humanity. And you don't see that as much now in things like immigration. Maybe that's a good example. Oh yeah, Mexico, we do whatever you want to them, right? And you see some of these parallels. So we need greater sensitivity across the board. We need to show it. We need to look for examples of people we disagree with whose rights are being trampled upon and look past our differences at least for a little while. And we can learn a lot from this book of people that did that in the past. We have a lot of potential heroes here to look up to, like Norman Thomas, the leading socialist of his day. Now we've got AOC and Bernie Sanders. Then you had Norman Thomas, who was incredibly willing to defend civil liberties for everybody and was respected by a lot of conservatives and a lot of libertarians. They say, I don't like this guy's views on but they respected Norman Thomas. Who respects AOC? Who respects Sanders? Well, maybe a few people do. But, because they're seen as selective. They're seen as just political operators.
Yeah. Well, that is a beautiful way to end this. Again, Dr. David Beito, that was an incredible summary of your book. Anyone that's interested in American history at all needs to pick up a copy of it. It's called The New Deal's War on the Bill of Rights. Before I let you go, where can people find your work and follow you?
All right. Well, you can find out about me at the Independent Institute, independent.org. I'm professor emeritus at the University of Alabama, so you can go to the history department site. There's a long biography there, including links to a lot of my work. And you can get the book on Amazon if you want. I certainly would urge you to go to independent.org, but you could see reviews. This is a book that has positive reviews from people on the left. The big one is a woman named Ellen Schrecker, who wrote a book called Many Are the Crimes, who's very much pro-Roosevelt on a lot of things. But I sent her the book on a lark and she endorsed it. Or she didn't endorse it, but she praised it, right? She thought I was right on what I found, at least right enough to give a positive blurb. So I wish I would have had more of that. But it is a book that I want leftists to read. I want everyone to read. I want them to scrutinize the source material. I'm sure there are errors in it. I'm sure there are mistakes, but I think I make that the information in the book makes a pretty good case that I think people need to grapple with. And I want them to. And if they want to take me down, go to it. Read the book. I feel like Gary Hart now. If you want to follow me around, go ahead.
Well, I'm going to put links to all that in the show notes. Dr. David Beito, thank you so much for coming on the show today.
You're welcome. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. If you have any questions or comments, please reach out to me at theprotestantlibertarian@gmail.com. You can also find me on Twitter. You can follow me at the handle @ProLibertyPod. Again, that is @ProLibertyPod. And you can also visit me at theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com. At theprotestantlibertarianpodcast.com, you can also support the Christians for Liberty Network and the Libertarian Christian Institute. Thank you guys so much for listening to this episode, and we will see you next Tuesday.